Welcome to the Thinking Fellows podcast. I'm producer Caleb, and I'm here with Dr. Keith and Dr. Adam Francisco. Today we're doing another episode of an interview with Dr. Francisco. He's one of our regular hosts, but we thought we'd do a guest-style interview with him over a couple subjects that he's an expert in. Last episode...
You're an expert in things?
No, I just make it all up.
Okay.
Like every good historian.
That's why he couldn't stop talking, right?
I just wanted to be sure.
I dabble in these things.
So last episode, we covered what's really your field of expertise now, or what most people publicly know your field of expertise being in, and that's
Other than
Islam. Wow.
Sorry.
Can I get through this introduction?
Yes,
and
go
then, and then today we're going to talk about Luther and apologetics. Now we're coming out of our apologetics series. You could consider these last two episodes part of the apologetics series, but they're kind of transition episodes, and especially this episode is, as we're moving into a series on great heroes of the Christian faith. And today we're talking about a subject that most people don't think about often, or I guess don't talk about often. I've never heard anybody talk about Luther on apologetics in my time in undergrad or apologetic courses that I've taken, or even church history courses that I've taken. It's usually Luther, and the Reformation. And so how does apologetics fit in to the Lutheran Reformation and into the theology of Luther, I think is an important question that people just don't know about. So Dr. Keith has prepared some stuff here to ask questions to Dr. Francisco. Now, is it true your master's thesis was in this topic? Is that what I hear?
Yeah, boy, man, that was 15 years ago. I wrote a MA thesis under Dr. Rosenblatt entitled something like Lutherans and Apologetics. And what it started with it looked at apologetics and Lutheran theology and whether the two could work together. The conclusion was that they could. And the second half was some examples of apologetic activity in the life and thought of Luther, in particular his writings on Jewish theology and Islam.
Yeah, I would think a lot of people would turn to Luther defending his positions against the Catholic Church, but that's not what we're particularly talking about here. We're talking about actually Christian apologetics to non-believers.
Mm-hmm, yeah, which wasn't a huge question in the 16th century. In Europe, Western and Central Europe, the population is generally speaking Christian. You've got some Jewish pockets of Jewish people. Eastern Europe, you've got Muslim Turks. But most people are Christian, so the conversation of the day is mostly what's biblical. What are the biblical doctrines? What are the doctrines of the church? And so it's an inter-Christian conversation for the most part. So you can't expect too much out of Luther in terms of apologetics, but he certainly did engage in what we would call today apologetic activity.
So is it redundant to ask you then, Adam, why is this a question? I mean, I can provide some of that after you're done, but I think it is a question.
It is a question for I guess a couple reasons. One, in Lutheran circles, because it's a historic tradition, there's a lot of deference given to Luther, right? So I find, I don't know if this is why this is the case, but people in Lutheran circles, and we'll talk about broader circles in a minute, but in Lutheran circles, people, theologians, pastors, and so on, if Luther didn't permit something, it's almost like you can't do it. And that's maybe hyperbole, but people look to Luther for permission, and Luther is a big authority for us. And this is hyperbole, but
it's the name Lutheran.
But if you look at Lutheran debates, hopefully most of the references are going to, if it's over theology, it's going to be to Scripture, and secondarily to the Lutheran confessions. But there's oftentimes, if you can, and again, this is hyperbole, but if you quote Luther on something, it's like you've won. If you got Luther's support. The curious thing with Luther is that he's all over the place. He wrote a ton, and he's not exactly it's not that he's chaotic in his thinking, but he's not as I'm kind of tired of saying, but he's not a systematic theologian. He's not like a Calvin where he's not going to repeat himself, and he's got his.
Or he's
major
going to start
concern.
at one point and move to another.
Yeah,
He doesn't
he addresses Luther is. I heard it once said he was an occasional theologian, meaning he was a theologian who spoke to these particular occasions. He's not a theoretician, if you will,
Right.
the way that kind of Calvin was. Kind of Calvin. That's an interesting phrase.
And the other thing I come in contact with a lot is when people quote him, they quote him almost out of order. The date context is mixed up, right? You get really early quotes against really late quotes for Luther, and people don't understand the movement in his theology from 95 Theses to his death.
Yeah. So, yeah. And I mean, kind of getting back, I mean, Luther's a big authority for Lutherans. And so if Luther is for something, Lutherans
believe that Lutheranism is for something.
Yeah. If I mean, generally, I mean, there are things Luther says that we, think his stuff, some of his real extreme comments on Jewish people, we don't follow that. I hope
Or we
don't.
don't talk about it much.
Yeah, conceal it.
Although there's been two fairly good, three actually, pretty good books that I'm aware of that deal with that a little bit.
Sure.
One by Lowell Green,
Yeah,
Montgomery, and I think Uwe too.
yeah,
Uwe.
fabricated Luther. Yeah,
I mean, some people have taken it as an extreme to say Lutheranism promotes Nazism.
sure,
right?
sure,
So,
which is dumb. But so you get Lutherans Luther is a big authority, and so the question of whether Luther would engaged in or would have been in favor of apologetics is a concern for Lutherans, for our broader listenership. I think that's the right terminology. Luther plays such a pivotal role, obviously, in the Reformation of the Church, and his theology, whether you're a Lutheran or not, is still comes to bear in the way Protestant evangelical Christians think today. So his approach to apologetics is being a biblical theologian, a theologian who is at the center very concerned with ensuring that his theology corresponds to the biblical text. It's worth paying attention to Luther. And just as maybe out of historical curiosity, there is this great long apologetic tradition in the church, and Luther is certainly very much a part of that.
One of the things I've run into, and you've alluded to it, I'll go more directly to it, I think, is that I've had conversations with other faculty members on campus in theology where they sort of question the need for apologetics as we approach it, I'd say evidentially, inductively, and will often say, hey, I don't think Luther ever felt it necessary to do anything like this, or I'm not aware that he has done anything like this, or and they sort of look more towards the internal consistency / verifiability of the scriptures inside themselves, really as proof, maybe that apologetics, at least from the evidential perspective, is not consistent with our theology, and would lean towards more what we've used sort of Vantillianism here as an example, and that type of thing, where really the only apologetic task that we can see in the scriptures or in as consistent with our theology is sort of going after the other person's position.
Yeah, a couple of things on that. One, Caleb, you'll have to put this in the show notes.
I will do it then.
Dr. Montgomery wrote a piece that's appeared in several places, and if you just type in Google the apologetic thrust of Lutheran theology, you'll get it in some source that argues in the way that Montgomery can argue very tightly that Lutheran theology is, with its emphasis on the incarnate Christ, is absolutely open to an evidential, historical apologetic. Second thing, Scott, you mentioned how there are some of the theologians you've spoken with have said that Luther didn't engage in apologetics, and if he did, it would have been this sort of like presuppositional, if the Bible, or internal consistency type of argument. So long as the doctrine is internally consistent, it's true. That type of argument. And you can actually find this in some of the scholarship. There is a book written by I believe he was a Wisconsin synod, which might not mean a whole lot to some of our listeners, but a particular brand of Lutheranism. A man named Siegbert Becker wrote a book called The Foolishness of God, and there's a chapter in there entitled Luther's Apologetics. And at the very end of the chapter, Becker says, in summation, what we could say concerning Luther's approach to apologetics, and Becker believed he did engage in some, we could say that the best way to describe it is the way he described it in a marginal comment on from his textbook on Lombard sentences.
Gotcha.
This old medieval systematic theology textbook kind of, where Luther wrote in the margin something to the effect that what the Holy Spirit says in the Bible is true, and that always settles it, or something like that. Now that's very early. That's pre-Reformer Luther writing that comment, right? So that's problematic. From Caleb, you mentioned something about with Luther's chronology. But what's curious with Becker and others who have Wayne House has written an article on Luther's apologetics, and there are others, is all these characters who write on Luther's approach to apologetics, they are looking at some of his statements from works that aren't apologetic in character. And they don't look at his writings to the real non-believers of his own day, his writing on the Jews or his writings on the Muslim Turks. People didn't really know a whole lot about his writings on the Muslim Turks up until maybe 2 decades ago. So the problem in a lot of the scholarship and some of the opinion amongst, I don't want to be too aggressive here, but some of the theologians, they're not reading appropriate material to get Luther's view of apologetics. So here's the thing. With Luther, if you want to know how he viewed apologetics, you probably ought to look at his apologetic work, not some other material, some works like, I oftentimes hear people quoting Luther's Bondage of the Will, which is a great work. We interviewed Jim Nestigan on the Bondage of the Will, I think months ago now, 8 months ago or something.
Yeah, August.
If you go to the Bondage of the Will, the beginning of the Bondage of the Will, Nestigan told us we should read it from the back, but if you go to the beginning part where he's going after Erasmus, and Erasmus's kind of aloofness or shyness in being overly assertive. And Luther says, Christianity, Erasmus, is about asserting doctrine, asserting truth. Christians delight in assertions, Luther writes. And then he explains, what does it mean? What does this mean, we delight in assertions? And he says, it means we constantly confess. And then he says, and also, and everybody forgets to quote defend.
Yeah.
Right.
What we believe is
the truth.
Yeah,
capital T, capital T.
Absolutely.
The truth.
So even in those works that aren't apologetic in nature, Luther is very much interested in defending the truth. Now, for Luther, being a guy who's an occasional theologian, depending on the occasion is going to determine how he approaches the apologetic task.
Right, and I'm struck with what you attributed to Montgomery, and I've heard you say it many times too, so sort of in my life it's attributed to you and to Rod. This idea that with Christianity's focus on the necessity of the incarnation, life, death, and resurrection of a Christ who was an actual person that existed in real time, real space, and real history, with Lutheranism's absolute need, I think I'll even say, for that truth to be true, and how the rest of our theology rests on that, it perplexes me when I get in these conversations, because I wonder how that works, systematically, how that works. If one believes that could not be true historically, and still be true theologically, how those two things come together. And I struggle with that because they can't for me, because at the end of the day, if I say that Christ's life, death, and resurrection for me are true as I know it from the scriptures, I'm not just saying that they're true because the scriptures are true. I'm saying those things are true, thus the scriptures are true, and they're true historically, thus they're true theologically, and thus they're true for me.
Yeah. I'm perplexed by it too. If you really believe in a real incarnation,
It has to be
not
true
some sort of
historically.
idea of an incarnation, but
It
an
has to be
actual
true.
incarnation, that the Word of God took on human flesh and tabernacled or dwelt among us. It is by definition maybe open to investigation.
Right.
That doesn't mean it's easy or everybody's going to see it or anything like that, but it is open to investigation if there was a real incarnation.
And if it's true, that has to mean historically too.
Absolutely,
Right.
absolutely.
Yeah.
I don't know that you can explain it theologically. I think a lot of this is sociological. You can look at it sociologically. There's this, if you move towards a more inductive approach to truth or knowledge, there's a lot of, it's probability. You're never going to get certainty. It's always going to be probability. Maybe high, 99% degree of probability, but it's not certainty. And theologians, especially in our times, where it seems like we're surrounded by critics of all sorts, it's almost like they're circling the wagons because they're scared. I'm not saying they're individually or personally scared, but
As a system.
if you open up to an inductive approach, it's possible you might not reach the right conclusions.
Right. And I guess I want to clarify too, just so I don't get bombasted here, is I absolutely believe that the scriptures are true, right? I'm an inerrantist, as they say. I believe they're inerrant. But having said that, that means that the information that they contain, which purport to represent historical events, have to be true too. And thus they happen in real time in real history and are subject to verification. Now, that doesn't mean I believe that that verification process will end up in the scriptures being shown to be untrue. Yeah. The other way around. I think that verification process is what shows me in a particular way that the scriptures are true, that they are infallible, that they are inerrant.
Yeah, I'm convinced though that those who are opposed to kind of an inductive evidentialist approach to things are, sociologically speaking, when all of a sudden you're acknowledging implicitly at least that there isn't certainty in these things, that's a problem for especially people who revel in dogma.
Right,
Not
at least the mathematical certainty.
Right.
Or as we would say earlier in the show's analytic certainty.
There is, I do get, sometimes you'll hear the argument, well, facts aren't just sort of bare things that interpret themselves. There is an insight from presuppositionalism, to use the technical terminology, that I think is legit, that says when you look at facts, historical or otherwise, people always bring their sort of frameworks, their worldviews
To them.
And interpret those facts in light of that worldview.
Postmodernism says the same thing.
Yeah, so I get that, when people, if they're rejecting an inductive approach because it's not going to bear any fruit because people don't view or approach things neutrally, or they're not able to put aside their biases or what have you. I get that. But that's not an excuse to scuttle the whole thing.
Right. Moreover, it might be a motivation for you to attempt to set your biases aside before you approach the question.
Yeah, and to persuade them that they're to expose their biases, their prejudices, and argue or persuade them, like Paul did before Agrippa, that the way they view things doesn't correspond well with the facts on the ground.
Right.
Maybe getting back to Luther a bit, I get, it's hard not to get, I'm sure you experience the same thing, not to get agitated when some of these
I'm easily agitated anyway.
Yeah, I know you're cantankerous, but when theologians, Lutheran theologians in particular, cite Luther and say, well, he was opposed to apologetics or never did apologetics, so we don't need to do them. Or even worse, when some bonehead, can I be that strong, says, well, Luther says that reason's the devil's whore. Apologetics uses reason to defend or promote the truth of Christianity. Therefore, apologetics is inappropriate, or it's whorish, maybe.
Yeah.
Stupid. you can find support of not any position, but lots of positions in Luther, even contradictory positions, if you just lift one proof text from Luther out. So when you look at Luther, I think of his great Galatians commentary. In the first volume of that, he says something to the effect that when you deal with Turks, Jews, and other sectarians, and Epicureans, when he uses the term Epicurean, he's kind of meaning the agnostics of his day, some that are popping up, especially in Italy in the Renaissance movement. When you're dealing with these people, he says, they don't care about the church, the doctrines of the church, and so on and so forth. You've got to deal with them or defend the faith before them on other grounds. You're in another area there, and you've got to use all your wisdom, your reason, and cleverness that you got in defending the faith before these types of people.
And Luther had quite a bit of cleverness in him.
Absolutely.
Okay, so that's a good jumping off point for us to take our first break in advertisement. So we'll see you after the break.
Welcome back from our break. Today we're going to talk about the first major conference of 2017 that 1517 is putting on, and that's Giving Kids Grace. Dr. Keith is one of the main stage speakers at that conference, featuring his book, Being Dad. And I think he's going to talk about why you should go, why you should buy a plane ticket out there if you're a little far away, and if you're in the area, why you should drive.
All right. Being Mom and Dad, Giving Kids Grace is a conference that will be held in Grand Rapids, Michigan, featuring Elise Fitzpatrick, Jessica Thompson, and myself. And we're basically talking about the idea of Christian parenting, but not from the perspective that you've probably heard before. This is not a law-oriented conference. This is the idea that your children have more law in their lives than you probably realize, and what does it look like when you focus your parenting on giving kids grace and being an example of grace in their lives. Elise Fitzpatrick and Jessica Thompson will do what makes Christian parenting Christian. Elise and Jessica will also do practical grace for parents and kids. They're very good on both the theoretical and the practical side. And then I'll be doing something that I've been wanting to do for a larger crowd for a while, and that's the idea of the lost art of masculinity, what it looks like when children actually have masculine fathers in their lives who define masculinity as being strong but gracious. So you should check it out. Again, the conference is in Grand Rapids, Michigan. The dates for the conference are, well, let me give you the location first of all. The location is St. Matthew's Lutheran Church in Grand Rapids. The address is right on the home page of givingkidsgrace.com. The date is February 11th, 2017. It's a one-day conference. The schedule is not a difficult one. I love it when conference schedules allow time for conversation and just some talking among the attendees, and ours does that. It runs from 9 a.m. to just after 2 p.m. 2 p.m. there'll be a Q&A session and a book signing. For registering, conference attendees get a free book, at least one free book, I think, maybe even two, either Being Dad or Give Them Grace or both. But check it out. The website again is givingkidsgrace.com, February 11th, Grand Rapids, Michigan. Elise Fitzpatrick, Jessica Thompson, Scott Keith, all doing their best to present an idea of Christian parenting that is framed from a perspective of the gospel and from graciousness, and completely unique, worth your time. Elise Fitzpatrick is a very well-known, and Jessica too, very well-known speakers and very highly sought-after speakers, and they've offered to partner with us on this, and we're very excited that they did. So again, givingkidsgrace.com, February 11th, Grand Rapids, Michigan. Check it out.
It's going to be a fantastic show. Great way for us to kick off 2017 and our speaking engagements.
Are you coming, or is Mom going?
I will be in school, so it's not travelable yet. I can only take off so many or skip so many classes a semester before my professors start to begin to be unhappy with me.
That's because you don't have Adam for any classes this semester.
That's right. He'd just be like, don't show up.
Not true.
Oh, okay. All right, check it out. Givingkidsgrace.com, February 11th, Grand Rapids, Michigan.
All right, sounds good. So let's talk about Luther just a little bit more.
Yeah, I wanted to maybe get us a little more refocused here.
You think?
Something happens when Rod's gone. We kind of bling, bling, bling
That's
all over
because
the
his
place.
stare is not looking down upon us.
So here we go. He's after all the radio professional. We're mere amateurs. So here we go. Adam, I wanted to just throw two things out to you that you can answer in succession, or if you get off track, I'll remind you. How would Luther define apologetics? And based on that, is there one sort of method that he used that could be sort of delineated, or was he sort of all over the place, opportunistic in that as well?
Yeah. He doesn't define apologetics the way a contemporary apologist would define it, or he doesn't really think I don't want to put words in his mouth or ideas in his head.
Well, you're a historian, isn't that what you guys do?
Kind of, but he didn't have to define it closely because it was understood and has been understood. I would argue for almost 2,000 years that when somebody has a question concerning the Christian faith, or rejects the Christian faith, or attacks the Christian faith, you ought to respond. So I think it's fair to say that Luther took it as a given that when Peter wrote, always be prepared to make a defense, an apologia for the hope within you, I think he believed that really stood. That wasn't just a suggestion or a recommendation, but Christians should be prepared to defend the gospel.
Exhortation, go do this thing, much like the Great Commission.
So he does this early on, with Rome. And then as he is increasingly pulled into more public affairs, already in the 1520s, there's issues with Jewish populations that come up. He's heard of Jewish theologians or Jewish writers attacking Christianity. There's a great, I don't remember his name off the top of my head, but he's a Jewish scholar out of Israel who wrote a nice paper a couple of years ago that he gave at the 16th Century Studies Conference, where he interestingly argues that the vitriol of Luther and others when they write on the Jews in the 16th century, which they get a bad rap for, this Jewish scholar says it was actually, first of all, very common, and second of all, in that context, justified. Because the Jewish authors who were poking fun at, calling Mary a whore and so on and so forth, they were using just as harsh and rigorous of polemics against Christianity. So
when we sort of, from our cultural perspective, say, boy, Christians have been mean throughout the centuries. Look at Luther and all the things he says. This guy's arguing that, listen, this was the time.
Yeah, this is not just Luther. It's not just Christians. It's just
we're soft. It's kind of pansies
and weak
now.
Yeah. So right after he's excommunicated from Rome in 1521, I believe it is, or 1522. I should probably know this since I'm a Luther scholar, but I don't have the time. He's excommunicated from Rome in 1521. He's becoming and is now a public personality. He's pulled into all sorts of controversies. The first one he has to deal with that deals with decided non-Christians are the Jewish people. And if you push aside all the distracting, nasty rhetoric,
polemical language,
which actually doesn't appear as it's not as harsh early on. It gets very harsh in the 1530s and 40s, but early on he writes works like that Jesus Christ was born a Jew, which is I think 1523 or so. A nice little apologetic to Jews, explaining that Jesus was in fact the Christ, the promised Messiah of the Old Testament.
I've heard it, and I don't recall if I read this in Lowell Green's book on sort of defending Luther and his polemics against Jewish people, or Montgomery's. But one of those two mentions that Luther's vitriol towards Jewish people was really framed by his disappointment after many of his personal attempts at evangelizing and providing an apologetic, and his real belief that the Reformation was going to provide an opportunity for a mass conversion of the Jewish people in his time.
Mm-hmm.
That just didn't occur.
Yeah. Mark Edwards wrote a book called Luther's Last Battles that not only makes that point, but also gets into the actual, or the the historical events, and he makes the point that there's good reason to believe, we don't have hard and fast evidence, but there's enough circumstantial evidence to suggest that Luther had, on at least one occasion, or a couple occasions, conversations with Jewish rabbis or scholars. And he believed early on that his understanding of the New Testament, this sort of Christological understanding, this notion or this understanding that the Old Testament pointed to Jesus clearly and distinctly, he was so convinced of that, he just did not understand why the Jews didn't find that a reasonable argument. And you can trace his writings on the Jews. And if you're looking at not getting distracted by all the vitriol, but you're looking at the arguments he puts forward, it gets increasingly more and more sophisticated. The earliest ones are just simple. I shouldn't say simple, but they're looking at Old Testament messianic prophecies and showing how they're fulfilled in Christ. But then he starts adding layers to his apologetic, making historical points. That not only is this a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy, but look at all the historical evidence that backs it up even further. So Luther doesn't do anything, and nor should we expect him to lay out a treatise on apologetic methodology. It's not a question in his own day and age. But you could argue that his apologetic methodology to the Jews was to take what common ground the Jews and Christians had, that is the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, and from that as a base, he argues inductively from passages in the Old Testament and historical facts to the truthfulness of Jesus being the Christ, the promised Messiah. So there's an inductive argument there. There's an evidential, if you will, a factual argument, even though it's very much wrapped up in interpretation of the Bible, the Old Testament in particular. Interestingly, there is no, like you said in the first half of the episode, there is no attempt to prove the truth of Christianity just by showing its internal coherence.
Right.
Luther is very, very much aware that the New Testament carries no weight for a Jew, and so he doesn't use it at all to argue for the gospel.
He's fulfill prophecy of the Messiah?
Mm-hmm. That's the gist of it. So it's inductive at its core and respective to the times.
Right. Using texts that they assume as true and veracious, and then using those and what they say about the coming Messiah to the accounts of the Messiah as we know them from recorded history.
Absolutely. And in all of Luther's writings on the Jews, as you get towards the later period, you become increasingly aware. He makes several comments to mentioning that he's tried to get his hands on and has in fact gotten his hands on as much Jewish material that he can get his hands on. He's doing his homework.
Yeah, these guys read like we wouldn't believe.
Yeah, and he's quoting Jewish sources, not just the Old Testament in some of these works. So think Paul at Mars Hill, where he quotes those Stoic poets. Luther knows full well you can't just go and quote New Testament passages and expect all of a sudden a Jew to kind of wake up and
say, "Wow, thank you." Yeah,
he takes the defense of the gospel, the attempt to persuade Jews of the truthfulness of Christianity very seriously, so much so that he spends time, probably a great bit of time, reading their own material to understand sort of the Jewish worldview, why it is they do not accept the gospel.
So again, he's sort of, much like in his theology, and I'm not using this as a pejorative, he's sort of opportunistic in this approach too. He'll use whatever is available to him.
I don't know if Luther would pass muster in some Lutheran circles.
Right.
See, Luther he's bound to the biblical text, to be sure.
But where that biblical text provides opportunities to either go after a position or to provide inductive evidence, he'll use it. Yeah,
he's very practical, maybe pragmatic, not in a modern sense of the terms, but when it comes to addressing things, he's going to use whatever he can. The further he gets away from a Christian audience, he's going to use whatever he can that might persuade that audience that they're wrong and he's right.
Right.
Put it in black and white terms.
Right.
His writings on I don't know if you wanted to get there right now, but his writings on the Turks and Islam are even more interestingly apologetic, I think, because he eventually will start in his last work on Islam, or one of the last works, he actually uses the Quran to make a case for the deity of Christ and the doctrine of the Trinity.
That's interesting. So would you say that the greatest apologetic challenge of the 16th century was Islam?
Yeah. So in the broad history of apologetics, after the period of the early church, after the conversion of Constantine, and throughout all of the medieval history, the Jews were the near apologetic challenge, but they're relatively small in number. The largest
and dispersed,
challenge,
right?
Yeah, very much dispersed, especially as you get into the 12th and later centuries.
And a minority, if not a sort of
and they
segregated minority.
They very much segregated themselves, but for a good reason. They were oftentimes persecuted, especially after the first crusade breaks out. As the Crusaders march across Europe, they find these Jews. They didn't think Jews existed in Christian Europe, and so they start persecuting them. Though there were popes and things who came to their defense. But Richard Southern, who wrote a great book called Western Views of Islam, probably one of the seminal books on this in the Middle Ages, argues right in the first or second page of the book that the greatest and most far-reaching challenge for medieval, that includes late medieval Christians, that's Luther included, is just the sheer existence of Islam. Because Islamic civilization in the Middle Ages is strong, vibrant. It kind of acts like a mirror to Christian civilization. Christians oftentimes, as some of them went on pilgrimages to the Holy Land. Some of them were there fighting in crusades. I hear all sorts of reports about Islamic civilization being, in some periods, very sophisticated, materially speaking, technologically. And Christians in Europe are wondering, what gives? Why is it that Islamic civilization is successful and we're plagued with the bubonic or the Black Death?
Yeah.
And a theodicy type of question emerges. Why does it seem that God is favoring them and not us?
Right.
So it's a big issue. A lot of stuff has been written on it, but not on a popular level. It's starting to come out. But when you get into Luther's day and age, a new stage kind of emerges where you get Islamic civilization renewing its push to expand Islamic civilization into Europe. And in fact, the Ottoman Turks, from their base in Istanbul, in Luther's day and age, in Luther's life, by 1529, they've pushed all the way through Hungary and are banging on the gates of Vienna, right next door, as Luther put it in one work, at our very doorstep.
Right.
So it becomes the great fear in the 16th century. It's a great distraction, too. The Pope and the Emperor are constantly distracted by the Turks, such that they kind of
leave the Reformation alone for a while.
in some periods. So,
at least in the early periods of the Reformation.
Yeah, and in Luther's works, he says around the time of Vienna, he says there's going to be a time. There probably will be a time in the near future where we're all going to be subsumed under the Turkish Empire. In his second introduction to the book of Daniel, he says if things continue the way they are, the whole world is going to go Mohammedan, which is a 16th century way of saying Muslim. So this is a big challenge. Not a whole lot of historians have dealt with it until very recently, but it's the challenge of the day. Probably a third, this is kind of a rough estimate, of the literature that's produced from 1453, when the printing press is first invented, to Luther's day and age, a third of that literature was dedicated to the threat and challenge that the Ottoman Turks posed to Christian Europe.
So Luther writes a little piece on what the Christians should do if they find themselves living in a Mohammedan land, right?
Yeah,
and
writes a number of pieces, yeah.
And what's his advice on that?
There's three things that Luther suggests Christians who might, because they're soldiers or they're just living in the frontiers, should have in mind for the future if they would happen to be taken captive by the Turks, or now
their land
might find themselves under Turkish rule. First is in a work he calls an army sermon or a muster sermon against the Turk. He says to those Christians, if you're all of a sudden find yourself under the Mohammedan Empire, consider that's what God has for you now. That's your new station in life. And in there, it's a remarkable work. It's not too long, not too short, but to make it real simple, he says to Christians there, you've got great opportunities living underneath the Turk. Great opportunities to serve your new master and to kind of shame Muslims by being a good, dutiful servant. We have a late 16th century source from a German Lutheran pastor who traveled to Istanbul, who said that the Ottoman Turks loved their German Protestant captives, their Lutheran captains in particular, because they were good, dutiful servants. Luther instructed them, if you're there, serve them well. They're your neighbor now.
An argument for vocation.
Yeah. Luther then says, if you're there, also though, if you're there, you will have opportunities to speak and to defend the gospel amongst the Muslim Turks. And he cautions, he says, do this cautiously and so on and so forth. But, and to that end, what Luther does is starts developing a repertoire of apologetics towards the Turks. The early one from late 1529, early 1530 in the Muster Sermon is relatively basic. But in that, his basic point is that if there is a sure defense of Christianity vis-a-vis Islam, it's based on the person and work of Jesus as a real historical person who really did die and who really did rise from the dead. He doesn't use the term verifying, but it's kind of the gist of it. He says he verifies his ministry he verified it by rising from the dead.
That's awesome.
Now, what's really incredible is after that, Luther, throughout the later part of his life, said, I wish I could get more material on Islam, primary source material, so I could speak a little more concretely about it, because all he had were sort of quotations from the Quran at that point. So finally, 1540s, he gets a copy of the Quran, quickly says, we got to get this thing published so that Christians can read about Islam on the primary source level. Because everything, Luther said, that's been written by Christians on Islam is filled with hyperbole.
Oh, wow.
So he was, interestingly, wanted to have the accurate information on Islam. He wasn't content with, like, polemical material. He wasn't content with
inaccuracies.
So he throws his weight behind a publication of the Quran and writes a preface to the Quran. And what's fascinating, just in the history of this publication of the Quran, is it's the first time the Quran is published successfully in Europe. Actually, published from a printing press ever. There's a preface written by Luther in it, and Melanchthon will write some prefaces to it as well for later editions. And it's not just the Quran, it's a bunch of other Islamic writings, some what we call hadith, some histories of Islam, and some apologetic stuff. And effectively, the book is huge. You know, it's probably like 8-10 inches thick. And it's, one scholar has called it the first encyclopedia of Islam.
Wow.
And you could argue, I've argued in my dissertation, that it was primarily Luther's support of this that got that thing published.
I'm sure.
And the letter he wrote to encourage the publication of it, he says that we need this published now here because the Muslim Turks are coming and Christians need to prepare themselves to become lion hearts in the defense of the gospel against Islam.
Do you recall which print house published it?
In Basel. Johannes Aperinus was the publisher. Theodore Bibliander was the editor. That was Zwingli's, one of Zwingli's successors. So he does that, and then the year following, 1543, he translates out of Latin into German a work called A Refutation of the Quran.
So just for historical perspective for our listeners, this is 3 years prior to his death. Mm-hmm. Right? So this is what's on his mind in his final years.
Oh yeah, he's convinced. If you read the table talk, the sort of the when he's hanging around with his students at the table and they're recording everything he says, like some of Dr. Rosenblatt's students have done. And we've got multiple volumes of this stuff. The Turks are a common reference in his conversation. Everybody's worried about the Turks coming in because at that time the Turks had just struck up an alliance with France too. So it looked like Germany is surrounded.
Yeah.
So anyway, 1543 he translates and adds to a work called A Refutation of the Quran, which comes from a Dominican a Thomist scholar in the late 13th, early 14th century. And it's a massive work. It's the most popular and the most learned apologetic and polemic against Islam. It's basically, there are two halves. The first half is much larger than the second, but it's an attack on the legitimacy of Islam, making the point that the Islam based on the Quran just cannot be true because the Quran is just filled with so many contradictions internally and contradictions with history and so on and so forth. Then the second part of it, Luther makes the point and adds in all sorts of his own little particular argument, says that now that we've destroyed the Quran, the basis of Islam, how do we defend Christianity in a Muslim, or how could a Christian defend the truthfulness of Christianity before a Muslim audience? And he says they don't accept the New or the Old Testament. They believe it's been corrupted. So what do we have? We have the Quran. And he argues there are places in the Quran, passages in the Quran that could be used as at least conversation starters, we might call them today. For example, one passage in the Quran refers to Jesus as the Kalimatullah, the word of Allah, the word of God. There's another place that refer to God.
Allusions to John 1 there.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's the way Christian apologists from John of Damascus in the early days through Luther that's the way they've approached Islam. There's a place in the Quran that refers to God, refers to the Word of God, and refers to the Spirit of God. And Luther believed that you could use these to at least argue before a Muslim that it is not entirely, you can't just rule out an incarnation or the Trinity because your Muslim scholars have told you to. The Quran itself suggests that these are possible understandings of God and
Interesting.
Jesus. So now it's not the most sophisticated, it's not an apologetic that meets today's standards, to be sure, but in the 16th century, it's sort of the cutting edge of apologetics, if you will.
Right.
And the curious thing with this little book is he writes it he purposely published it so it was like I forget it's a real small book. There's a technical term for it. That refers to how many times they fold pages.
Quarto?
Yeah, I think it's one
Octavo?
step. Yeah, that's
Octavo,
it.
yeah.
So a small little booklet, and he did this on purpose so that people who are on the front lines in the battles with the Turks could bring this apologetic work in their
best
pocket.
pocket work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bring it with them, so if they get caught, if they're taken captive, or they're sitting in their, they're not in trenches, but they're sitting behind walls or something, and there's not a whole lot going on, they could read it, and they could prepare. So for those people who say that Luther was not interested in apologetics, even inductive apologetics, they really need to go and read Luther's apologetic work.
Read more thoroughly.
Yeah, not just go to the index or an electronic search engine to see what Luther might say about it in one particular work, but it's very clear that he believes it's sort of a task for the church. In fact, there's a scholar, a fairly famous scholar at Fort Wayne the seminary in Fort Wayne, Concordia Theological Seminary, named David Scare, who wrote a nice little article in the fellowship for Charles Mansky, the founding president of Concordia University, Irvine. And the title is Apologetics, a Necessary and Biblical Task. Luther is a biblical theologian. He cannot get around the exhortation, 1 Peter 3:15, that all Christians are to always be prepared to make a defense for the hope that is within them.
Right. That's great. So, Adam, where could people go if they wanted more on this specific subject of Lutheran apologetics?
It's
kind of rough, isn't it?
Give it a little while, but I'm not sure when this episode's going to air. I know we talked about it just 15 minutes ago, but I don't remember.
Late January.
Okay, so I'm going to be given a presentation on this at Fort Wayne. CTSFW.edu puts those presentations live, or there's live streaming, I think, and they will archive it, and then eventually it'll be, if it's good enough, it'll be published in their journal. So there's that. There's a great book called Luther's Last Battles by Mark U. Edwards. I say U. Edwards because there's a Mark J. Edwards, but Mark U. Edwards used to be out of Harvard. I think he's now deceased. That's not a book on Luther's apologetics, but gets into the history of all this. My master's thesis, if we maybe post pieces of it on the blog.
We should.
I'm not a blogger, but
you could edit pieces of your master's thesis.
Yeah. Maybe for
that would be a good
$1,000 a
project
post, I could probably do that for.
Yeah. Or 50.
Or 50, yeah. How about a sandwich?
Or Frog Morton.
That'd be $1 a word.
Or a beer. You got beer in your fridge here.
I got beer.
So,
I'm going to do beer.
I don't know. There is stuff out there, but I hesitate to say this, but I think a lot of it's not that good.
All right. Well, we'll wait for you to guide us through this.
Sounds like the topic of your next book there, Adam.
Did you see the look of exhaustion that just came over at him? All right. Well, thank you for joining us. And Caleb, any closing remarks?
No, thank you for listening. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter at The Thinking Fellows. We have a wonderful website full of show notes for you, thinkingfellows.com. Go visit there. We also have a new archive page up on the website. So if you missed an episode, if you want to catch up with some episodes, or you want to re-listen to something and you're having a hard time finding it, everything there is ordered by the date that it was published and has the name and the topic that it's a part of on there. So it's really easy to navigate, so you can go check that out. I'll have a direct link to the archive in the show notes.
All right.
All right. Thank you for listening. Catch you next time.